Hey, welcome back. So, today we're getting into a preview of one of the large scale models we'll talk about later in the course that's sort of built up from many other efforts previously. So, it's sort of constructed of things you'll find in the more simple models that we will cover. And this one today is the Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network. It's a mouthful, so we just call that SPAUN. It's a pretty complex image here. We'll get into some of this later, but yeah, what's the deal? What is SPAUN? So it's the semantic pointer architecture and a unified model within that architecture. Let's break that down. What's the semantic pointer architecture about? It's a framework for modeling, for modeling cognitive processes specifically, that uses nearly exclusively biologically simulated neurons, i.e. each one of the neurons in this system emits real-time firing rates the same way an actual neuron would in time, not just sort of the abstract version you find in artificial neural networks and like machine learning stuff and modern AI, right? This is really trying to tie the behavior to spiking patterns as opposed to just sort of the numerical abstraction of those spiking patterns. And so as an architecture, that means that they've essentially, if you build a model in this system, they've done some of the modeling for you. They've said, hey, here's how a neuron will behave, and here's how a neuron will behave in a group of neurons, so a population of neurons. And here's how, here's patterns for connecting one population to another population. We'll get into all that some other time. But the main idea is that they have made a bunch of structural decisions. Remember, that's part of the theory when you do this stuff, that says, hey, we think these are a lot of good ways, well-founded, well-grounded ways to string together these neurons to make things happen, make information transformation start to occur in ways that are, again, biologically plausible. So that's kind of the idea of the framework. You see that elsewhere. ACT-R is another architecture. Transformers are an architecture in AI. So all of these things kind of fit in the same concept of architectural. Now you build models within them. Well, okay, we'll get into the unified network model in a minute. The other concept here is the idea of semantic pointers. Now, this was a tricky thing and still is in the field of cognition and cognitive science, which is like, how can we turn like raw biological, like light information hitting the eye eventually become some kind of abstract representation of the idea of car that I can use. I can know things about car, and I can do operations about car. I can realize that car exists. I can match car to many different versions of car. But I can use this abstract version, this abstract representation somehow or another. And the idea of this architecture is, hey, we've built ways to do that using literally only neurological firing patterns that we believe to be biologically plausible. So this is a system that lets you build essentially fake little brains that process things the same way that neurons do, as far as we understand neurons, or at least some types of neurons. And we can have it do things like abstract processes like mental math, and even could do language, things like this. So that's the architecture. That's like kind of the thrust of this thing. I should mention it's developed by the Elias Smith Lab. They have their entire whole ecosystem. I think they're still up and running pretty well. They've done a lot of interesting stuff over the years, but we'll touch base with them later. The unified network part of this model is within the architecture. The same team who built the architecture then also said, hey, we're going to go and we're going to try and build a system that models some of the information processing that we know the brain can achieve, but in very specifically like neurological regional ways. So they built this 2.5 million neuron model called SPAUN, consisting of visual input. So there's this 20. It can look at a 28 by 28 pixel image, meaning there's 784 neurons looking at it. Maybe more. It's probably more than a single neuron each, but basic idea. Neural populations that then a bunch of neural populations that mimic the behavior of various brain regions, like the basal ganglia, the thalamus, the prefrontal cortex, the kinds of operations we know that these systems are involved in. They create little versions of those. So a tiny basal ganglia, a tiny thalamus, responsible for transforming information in ways that we have found in biological research that make it fit. And then finally, a physical output system where they simulate the neural activity of muscles to make a little fake arm draw the answer, right? It's still all simulated, it's still all within the simulation, but it's able to draw the output in real time. So it solves, this thing solves abstract problems, so like things like counting and addition and list memorization and things like this, classic, psych tasks, by mapping visual inputs from the world to abstract internal patterns that move around in ways that they have prescribed with the structure of the model, and doing symbolic actions on them, then outputting them back to the world, all through this biologically plausible simulation of neural activity under the hood. So yeah, that's the short of it. This is the idea of this model. Quickly, we'll have a look. What do I mean when I say that they modeled it? They built models. We'll have a look at this. I think I'll mute it. So this is a super sped up version of somebody building models in their Nango software. So you see they're using code, but you can also use the other side. And here, we'll slow down. We'll rewind a bit. So they are building things like they're saying, oh, make an ensemble. That's a group of neurons. Oh, make that ensemble hook up in this way to this one, right? So little bits of code on the right are translated into this like network diagram over here, which will become the simulation. You can also see this movement window down here. We won't talk about the exact thing they're modeling here. I'm not even sure, but you can see as when you let the simulation play out, you can see the actual firing of the neurons in the ensemble. This neuron ensemble, for example, the movement one, is an ensemble of 100 neurons, and I think the 2 means 2 layers. We're only seeing 1 layer, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. By 10, these are the literal neurons. You want to see them fire? That's what it's doing, right? It's simulating the exact like activity of neurons. Now, are they real neurons? No. But they follow the rules of biology much more closely. So when you go to build a model of something in Nango, this is what you're doing. The architecture comes in to say, oh, hey, we figured out how to build, ensembles for you. That's part of the architecture. What you choose to model is up to you. So speaking of choosing what to model, did it work? I think it's working. So this is SPAUN in action. I think I'm going to play the whole thing. It's like 2.5 minutes first, and then we can, I'll chime back in and we can do a breakdown of some of the parts of it. Oh, wait. Why did you not play, sir? There we go.
My colleagues and I at the University of Waterloo have built a large-scale model of a functioning brain called SPAUN. The model receives its only input as a 28 by 28 pixel image and controls a simulated arm. In this video, we see both the activity of the various brain areas and decodings of the neural representations in those areas. The first task is a recognition task. SPAUN writes the digit it sees in the image. Individual neuron voltage spikes are shown scrolling through the thought bubble at the back of the brain. The decoded value is displayed on top of that activity. The second task is called copy drawing. Instead of just recognizing the digit, the model must reproduce the style of the digit. Here it successfully copies 2 styles of the number 2. SPAUN's representations are thus useful for both categorization and encoding fine perceptual details. The next task is a counting task. This task demonstrates that SPAUN can not only represent and categorize numbers, it also has an understanding of numerical concepts like order. SPAUN is first shown a number to start counting from, 4, and then it is shown how much to count by, 3. We can see the internal progression of numbers as it counts and finally writes its answer. Next, we have a question answering task. Here, SPAUN memorizes a list of numbers and then answers a question about the list. You can watch the topmost working memory as it stores the items in the order they are shown. In this case, SPAUN is asked what is in position 5. SPAUN answers the question by decoding its working memory and using the result to drive the arm. The final task is a serial working memory task, in which SPAUN must memorize a list of items in order and then repeat it back. We have seen several tasks that SPAUN performs correctly, but the errors it makes are equally important to determining if it is a good model of human cognition. Note that the darkness of the letter in the thought bubble indicates how well that item can be decoded from the current representation. SPAUN is now drawing its memory of the list, but when it gets to the 8, it is no longer confident in its own decoding of that memory, so it draws a horizontal line indicating it has no answer. If we look at the pattern of errors over many versions of SPAUN, we will notice that it matches the details of human error patterns. We have now seen half of the tasks that SPAUN can perform.
Okay,
The rest are in.
that's fine. So, right, let's kind of recap a little bit. This is similar to what we just looked at the modeling. These are all different areas, and in SPAUN, the unified network version, the model that they're talking about here, each of these would be a little population of some kind, an ensemble. They've just designed these ensembles to try and mimic behaviors we've collectively observed in brain structures over the years. So this thing is trying to do it's able to take in, real world-ish types of information, so a pattern of pixels like we might see, and it's able to turn that into some kind of abstract form, which is captured by this firing pattern here. You can see here, we'll mute them. Watch how these patterns change around. So here's a pattern. 5 hits here, 6 appears here, right? So they come in from the right. So when it changes, eventually this is the pattern for 5. That's the pattern for 9. Oh, and then it adds even more. I'm just trying to highlight, let's go back to a simpler task. Trying to highlight that what it's doing is it's doing this like arbitrary representation of symbols, which is wild. This here is a neural pattern mapped to the concept of 4. That concept of 4, well, hang on, it's waiting to do the task. That concept of 4 can prime a representation that's a little bit more spatial, right? So 4 is the concept, and it looks like this. It's like lots of spiking, firing patterns near the top of this array and nothing at the bottom, but that's mapped to an outputable 4. Continues, and we see that the pattern changes, right? This was 4. It's a little blurry, I know. Check out the video yourself to really see it, but notice it's different, right? And the same way that, the lines of a 4 and the lines of a 5 have nothing to do with each other. It's not like 5 is one more something than 4 in the way we draw them. They're arbitrary. They're symbols. These are symbols captured in neurons. You can watch it change again. Becomes 6. 5 is there. 6 is a little different. The point of them being that they are distinguishable from another network can look at that pattern and say, that's a 6. Again, doesn't need to draw it, doesn't need to have any other representation, it just needs to be this arbitrary symbol of the concept of 6. So, because it's able to do all that, it's able to look at things and say, okay, my current task is to add these numbers together or whatever. I'm supposed to count, right? Let's break down the counting task. So, here we are. This is SPAUN, our buddy, and it's trying to do the counting task. I'll just set it up for you. It has a starting number in its mind that it read off of the screen. The numerical concept is 4. This is where we're starting from, the symbol 4. And it also knows that it needs to count 3 times, count forward 3 times. Now, your clever human brain, of course, you jump straight to 7. You know the answer. But the process of doing that, especially when you're not very good at like math yet, say you're a kid, The process of doing that involves this strung together process of, okay, I need to take this symbol, figure out what comes next, figure out what comes next, figure out what next, and then do that 3 times. I got tangled there, didn't I? So let's watch that happen. The working memory area contains this symbol pattern of 4, right? It's the, oh, that's my current number. And that 4, again, is tied to this spatial representation somewhere else in the neural structures, so that if it needed to output it to the arm, it could. Right now, it doesn't need to because it still knows it's at the start of the task. So this 4 goes into some kind of what's the next number network. And so it takes this arbitrary symbol 4, and it knows, well, the next number would be the arbitrary symbol 5. Great. 5 is tied to a different representation spatially. Nothing happens in the arm. Then we keep counting to 6. This is a little blurry. I had to crop it from the video, so it's messy. But again, remember, you see the shape is changing of the neural firing patterns to different arbitrary shapes. Tied to a physical shape, great. 7, aha. Some other part of this model is keeping track of how many times I have counted until we get to 3. So now we're at 7, something triggers, we're good. This is the answer. I'm going to take the activated physical representation of 7, the spatial representation of 7, i.e. how I might draw it, and do that. I triggered this system now sends this spatial representation out to the arm neurons, and it does 2 little lines. And it does them screwy, just like a person does. You can see it's kind of wobbly. That's because the neurons are firing all over the place, just like ours do. So if you have bad handwriting, this model's got your back. So that's the idea. This is Spawn doing this thing. Now, how all this happens, we'll talk about it later. In fact, that's kind of the idea. We'll get into Spawn again later, but I just wanted to give you this background on it. So, it's this, what is it? What's the takeaway? Spawn is this cognitive modeling effort because it's attempting to model transformation of information in a way that matches scientific models of human neurobiology. It also hopes to match models of cognitive, decision-making stuff, but it sort of lives at this lower level. It's up to the modelers to start building those structures, which they have done. They've done a little bit of hey, we made what we think looks like a basal ganglia, and it behaves the same way as one. So, who knows? To add a little more on that is it's very cool because if this effort continues and improves, and we add new neural types because those are always being discovered on occasion. We add new knowledge about how different structures can transform information in the brain. You keep building on this. Eventually, you might reach a point where, hey, this thing really predicts a lot of neural activations and neural patterns. And hey, it's actually matching up with the fMRI data. And you get to a point where this model really does closely model humans. Well, now you can do crazy things like, hey, what if I just remove this part of the brain from the model? What does that change? What if I remove a specific shape column of neurons in the frontal cortex? Maybe we can finally get some insights into what went on with Phineas Gage. That's all down the line, So this particular model built in the system is not correct. We know that. We know that models are not correct. And on top of that, it may not even really resemble the exact pathways that exist in the brain. They've done this one where they said, okay, we have visual comes in and connects to a thalamus and the basal ganglia, blah, 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 blah. But that may not be the exact way it works in the brain, but the real key insight is that they are simulating all of this at the level of individual neurons firing. And thus, we know that anything you build in this system technically could be possible with just a lump of neurons. Get the right kind and simulate them the right way and hook them up the right way. You could make Spawn out of biological tissue. Ugh. It'd be gross, but it would be impressive, right? And that's kind of the core insight of this structure. There's no tricks. There's no asking the computer to do its math for it. It's all biologically grounded. Everything that occurs never leaves the biological simulation. And that's pretty cool. Okay, so that's it for today. Take care.